The 11th lesson looks at the police state that the Nazis imposed on the German people after taking over in January of 1933. It considers the different elements that make up the police state, as well as the different roles that they had in society. The Nazis, of course, were concerned with keeping power. Now, it's really important to note that the Nazis' use of the police state is but one of the ways they keep power. They will institute a number of different ways to rule and control the German people, of which the police state is one. You will need to know the elements of this state, and then, therefore, how those elements would have controlled the German people. Now, all of this has to do with support. In March 1933, the last general election of the Weimar Republic saw the Nazis' support increase to just under 44%, which was not enough for a majority. After this, there are plebiscites to gauge public opinion, which obviously reveal a surge in support for the Nazis. And one of the keys that I guess we're trying to get at here is that it's really hard to know how popular Hitler was. It's really hard to know how popular the Nazis were in Germany. So you get that sense of the argument that develops. Was this a dictatorship based on popularity? People really approved of the Nazis? Or, if as evidenced by the last general election of the Weimar Republic, do the majority of Germans not support the Nazis? Because, of course, the majority would be more than 50% voting for them. Now, those plebiscites I mentioned oftentimes show that the Nazis are wildly popular. However, they don't necessarily accurately reflect true support, and there's a lot of reason to be skeptical about them. Obviously, there's no opposition parties. They're all banned and sent to concentration camps, more of which I'll talk about later. And the votes are counted and published by the Nazis themselves, not necessarily the most trustworthy of sources for publishing news about how good or how popular they are. The Nazis are obviously very much probably going to overestimate their popularity, blow it wildly out of proportion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the question of how effectively did the Nazis control the German people is the interesting one. The Nazis do enjoy considerable support. Even though those plebiscites are rigged, there's plenty of evidence to show that they do. The biggest one, and the biggest piece of evidence that historians point to, is the fact that there's almost no large-scale organized opposition during these years. There's no Munich putsches or Kapp putsches. There's almost nothing. The fact that there's no significant revolts, rebellions against the Nazis, suggests that the methods of law enforcement and control must have been extremely effective. To ensure absolute obedience, it's also important to remember, though, that the Nazis favored persuasion and indoctrination, not necessarily outright terror, but they ensured that there was a healthy and well-organized terror state for those who were unresponsive, if you will, those people who did not respond, or those people that relied, that didn't follow the Nazi message. And this sort of terror system relies on force and, of course, the notion of creating an atmosphere of fear or terror. The police state, as evidenced by the person on the right-hand side, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, employed a range of powerful organizations and weapons to control and terrorize the German people into submission. The most notable of them are the SS and the Gestapo, the secret police which operate under the SS. These people will work with a network of informers. They will also have at their disposal the use of the concentration camp system to put political prisoners or undesirables, and they will influence and, of course, use the police and the court system to feed the terror apparatus. Now, I'm going to explain all of these individually. The SS, probably the most well-known element of terror in Nazi Germany, had been formed, as you remember, in 1925 from fanatics loyal to Hitler, and of course it evolves from his personal bodyguard. After the destruction of the SA, the purging of Ernst Röhm in the Night of the Long Knives, it grew into a huge organization with many different responsibilities. And of course, the SA is placed under the control of the SS following the Night of the Long Knives. And it was mentioned, or led by the aforementioned Heinrich Himmler, one of the most nefarious characters in the whole Nazi story. The primary role of the SS was to destroy opposition to Nazism, as well as carry out the racial policies of the Nazis. They had, under their sort of reign and powers given to them because Hitler had the Enabling Act, the power to arrest, detain without charge, interrogate, and search and confiscate property. The primary agent of terror within German society was an organization under the SS banner known as the Gestapo. This is a secret state police. The Gestapo comes under the role or the oversight of the SS in 1936. This is by far the most feared arm of the German law system. Okay, the average German citizen, though many probably would have never come in contact with the Gestapo, certainly knew of them and feared them. It had sweeping powers to arrest people on suspicion. It could send people to concentration camps. Interestingly, though, modern research has shown that a lot of Germans thought that the Gestapo were more powerful than they were. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's quite a lot of research coming out right now that shows the Gestapo were actually more powerful in idea than they were in actual reality. A city like Leipzig, for instance, a city of approximately 650,000 people, had around 30 to 40 Gestapo agents working in it. If you consider, that's not a lot of people to police a city of that size. The Gestapo actually, 95% of the things that they did weren't because the Gestapo had actually investigated and found out things. It's actually because people had reported other people to the Gestapo. And what we find is the Gestapo relies on a system of informers. One of the arguments that people use to say perhaps the terror state isn't as powerful is the fact that the terror apparatus did not go out and actively find dissidents or people who were rebelling against the regime in both thought and action. What they did actually rely on was a system of informers. You had all over Germany local Nazi officials reporting on the reliability of their residents. People were actively encouraged to be vigilant, report anti-Nazi talk and activities. What we see are husbands reporting on wives, children on their parents, ordinary people on their neighbors. Creates enormous fear of the system of informant, and of which the Gestapo is sort of the overseers of the informant system. But it also, interestingly enough, has been used to settle personal scores. Wives would report on husbands in domestic abuse cases and say, because domestic abuse, unfortunately, at this time was something that was a little bit more common and not necessarily policed, not only in Germany, but everywhere else. Wives who were angry at their husbands would report them for being anti-Hitler to the Gestapo. Interestingly enough, the overwhelming majority of people who had been informed or released. Actually, the Gestapo paid very, very, very little attention to a lot of the cases they got, unless that person was, let's say, a socialist or a communist or a racial enemy of the state. If you were an Aryan German, you probably got off the hook. Anyways, nevertheless, the system of informers creates an atmosphere of fear. As Richard Evans, the famous historian, will say, it let everybody understand what the consequences of nonconformity were. The other widely known and widely publicized, because the Nazis made no secret of the fact they were doing this, was the creation of the concentration camps. And in fact, they create concentration camps within months after taking power. Dachau is opened only 2 months after Hitler takes power, and Dachau is a large concentration camp outside the city of Munich in Bavaria. It is the ultimate sanction against their own people. These guys were run, or these concentration camps were run by the SS, a particular unit known as the Death's Head Detachment, who would run both the concentration camps and later during the war, the death camps like Auschwitz and so on and so forth. At these concentration camps, the prisoners were forced into hard labor. Food was limited and poor. Prisoners suffered harsh discipline, beatings, and random executions. Mental torture was equally doled out, as well as physical torture. Eventually, as the 1930s progress, the death rate actually also starts to increase. It's really important to note that the concentration camp is not a death camp. This is not there are no gas chambers in these. The death comes at a rapid pace in a concentration camp, but not necessarily in the manufactured way. It will take in the way the final solution does. By the late 1930s, death becomes increasingly common and few emerge alive. Jews, communists, trade unionists, churchmen, and anyone brave enough to criticize the Nazis ended up there, and they end up there quite quickly. We also have, in Nazi Germany, a system whereby the police, the courts, and the judges also work to serve the system of terror operated by the SS. Top jobs in local police forces went to high-ranking Nazis reporting to Himmler. The police added political snooping to their normal role. The Nazis took over the existing court system, requiring judges to take an oath of loyalty to Hitler. Jewish judges and lawyers were sacked, and it became illegal to be both Jewish and a lawyer or a judge in Nazi Germany. Therefore, any sort of quote-unquote enemies of the state were purged, making the police courts and judges more reliable. In other words, making them essentially serve the Nazis. The Nazis additionally will set up special courts for dealing with political crimes. In Germany, the age of the death penalty is dropped to 16 years old. And of course, things like telling anti-Nazi jokes and listening to foreign radio stations carry the death penalty. The whole nature of this system is that the way, if you ended up in the Nazi court system, it's likely that you aren't going to receive a fair trial. Of course, everything is coordinated or aligned with the Nazi ideology. And if you ended up there, it's pretty sure where you would end up afterwards, if likely a concentration camp or in some cases execution. Even though there's not a huge amount of executions in Nazi Germany, I think before the First World War, there were less than 100 for political crimes. Certainly that increases during the war. In fact, it increases massively because the war puts different strains on German society and creates opposition. Arguably, you could say the fact that there are so few executions in Nazi Germany leads to the fact that perhaps a lot of people just went along with the Nazis. Anyways, make a long story short, the whole system, therefore, was aligned to create a system where you know what the consequences of nonconformity were. Fear and terror were pervasive, if not, touching people in their everyday lives. People certainly knew they were there, and everything was set up to feed the Nazis' obsession with controlling the people. Just going to leave you on one last note. I read a very interesting book last summer. The book's called The Gestapo, The Myth and Reality of Hitler's Secret Police by Frank McDonough. It's an interesting book because it's a clear and direct challenge to that sort of conventional wisdom that everybody's belief. Most people believe, oh yes, the Germans were terrifying. They had the Gestapo and the SS, and they made everybody do what they say. And if you did it, you ended up in Dachau. Not necessarily the case. This book actually shows a more detailed and nuanced perspective. It sheds light on the question of whether or not this is a dictatorship that relied on fear or public consensus. And I think the overwhelming result of the findings of this book is that the Nazi state didn't necessarily operate totally on the fear principle. It operated on people really buying in. And if there was fear, that fear was certainly fed by the people who, through their support of the Nazi machine, fed the terror system. So anyways, it may be a worthwhile, interesting extension read, something you may want to pick up over the summer, something that you may find interesting down the road. But I highly recommend this book. It's eminently readable, and it's a very, 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 very interesting perspective. Now, that was my outline of the terror state, the degree to which you need to know it, and in fact, how you should think about it. We'll come back and we'll start looking at other ways the Nazis controlled the people, not having to do with the concentration camps and the SS and the Gestapo, but equally as effective in making sure Germans toed the Nazi line. But that's for next lesson.